My name was Governor Alexander Revius Ketch of Sanctum Tertius, jewel of the Segmentum Pacificus, home to 400 million souls who trusted me to shepherd them through the darkness of the 41st millennium. They told us the Emperor protects. The priests chanted it. The propaganda broadcasts repeated it every morning at 6 bells. The ecclesiarchy preachers carved it into our hearts with ceremony and conditioning until we believed our devotion could shield us from the uncaring void. I sit now in a throne room constructed from 17 million skulls. I counted each one, you understand, because a saint must know his flock, and I am waiting for the Arbites to break through the last barricade. They are shouting words like heretic and insane through vox amplifiers that make their voices sound like grinding machinery. They do not understand. How could they? They were not chosen. They did not hear the voice that whispered through the static of my daily prayers, revealing the sacred mathematics of purification. The floor beneath my boots is slick with 3-year-old blood that never quite dried in Sanctum Tertius's humid, subtropical climate. The smell is beyond description now, not rot exactly, because we burned the bodies in the cathedral incinerators daily, but something else. Ash and copper and the particular sweetness of bone marrow rendered to char. My robes, once fine Departamento Munitorum purple trimmed with gold, are so stained they're effectively brown, stiff with dried fluids that crackle when I move. I am 47 years old. I have not slept in 819 days. I have not needed to. Saints don't require sleep, but let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the day I became holy. My name is Alexander Revius Ketch, and I am so very, very tired. I have been Planetary Governor of Sanctum Tertius for 11 years, appointed at 36, after my father's heart finally surrendered to the stress of managing an agri-world responsible for feeding 17 systems. The appointment ceremony lasted 6 hours. The ecclesiarch of our subsector anointed my forehead with oils that smelled of incense and rust, droning prayers I'd been conditioned to repeat since childhood. In the Emperor's name, let this servant govern with righteousness. Let his wisdom flow from the golden throne. Let him protect the faithful and punish the heretic. Standard propaganda. I'd heard it so many times the words had become sounds without meaning, like the hum of atmospheric processors or the distant rumble of cargo haulers. Sanctum Tertius was beautiful in its way. A world of endless golden grain fields stretching to horizons, interrupted only by the black spires of processing facilities and the gray blocks of worker habitations. 400 million people living lives of routine agricultural labor. Plant, harvest, process, ship. The cycle repeated every 6 months with the regularity of a cogitator's processing loop. We met our tithes. We supplied our sector. We were, by Imperial standards, successful and utterly unremarkable. I governed from the Planetary Palace in Capital Primus, a sprawling complex of administrative buildings, adeptus offices, and residential quarters for the nobility. My private chambers occupied the highest tower, 12 rooms of polished rockcrete and genuine wood paneling imported from a death world 3 systems away, furniture upholstered in real leather, windows of actual glass overlooking the city's million lights. I had everything a man could want within the narrow parameters the Imperium permits ordinary humans to want, and I was desperately, crushingly, existentially exhausted. The morning everything changed began like every other morning for the past 11 years. I woke at 5 bells to my servitor attendant's gentle mechanical chiming, a lobotomized criminal who'd been convicted of theft and given the Emperor's mercy of continued service. They told us servitors were blessed, their sins purged through transformation into useful tools. I'd been raised to believe this. The servitor's face was a blank mask of synth flesh, its eyes replaced with red photoreceptors, its hands removed and replaced with various domestic implements. Brush, cloth, water dispenser. It dressed me with mechanical efficiency, fastening the 17 buttons of my formal coat with clicking precision. I looked at myself in the mirror, a tall man too thin from stress, Dark hair graying at the temples, though I was only 47. Deep lines around my mouth from maintaining the governor's expression of stern benevolence. My eyes were brown, ordinary. My face was ordinary. I was ordinary, and that was the problem. My breakfast arrived at 5:30 bells, delivered by human servants who averted their eyes appropriately. Protein paste derived from processed grain, flavored with chemical compounds meant to approximate meat. Water purified through 17 filtration stages. Synthetic tea. I ate methodically while reviewing the day's reports on data slates. Sector 7's eastern quadrant had experienced equipment failure. Harvest yields down 3.2%. Mechanicus Tech Priest en route to perform sacred maintenance rituals, which I understood, despite my indoctrination, meant he would consult actual technical manuals the Mechanicus hoarded and jealously guarded, pretending the knowledge was divine revelation rather than inherited engineering. Worker Hab Block 93 reported 17 cases of grain lung disease. Terminal. Expected mortality, 100% within 6 months. The Departamento Munitorum had already assigned replacement workers from the birth lottery pools. The 17 dying men would continue working until they physically collapsed. Their corpses would be rendered into protein paste to feed other workers. The cycle continues. The subsector ecclesiarch requested my attendance at a ceremony dedicating a new cathedral. 4 hours of chanting, ritual, and sermons about the emperor's divine protection. Protection that manifestly did not extend to the 17 men dying of grain lung, or the thousands who would starve if we failed our tithes, or the millions who lived lives of grinding monotony punctuated by arbitrary death. I set down the data slate and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw spots of color in the darkness. My father used to sit in this chair. I remember I was 12 years old. Finding him here at 3 a.m, still in his ceremonial robes from some administratum function, staring at the same kind of reports. I'd asked him why he looked so sad. He'd looked at me with eyes that seemed 1,000 years old and said, "Because, Alec, I send thousands to their deaths with my signatures, and the Imperium calls it governance. I pray to a corpse on a throne, and the priests call it faith. I watch good men ground into paste to feed the machine, and I call it necessary. And the worst part, son, is that I'm right. It is necessary. And that knowledge will hollow you out until there's nothing left but the signature on the execution orders." He died 3 years later. Heart failure, the medicae said. I thought it was more accurate to say his heart simply gave up. I understood him now in ways I wished I didn't. By 6 bells, I was in my office, a vast chamber of dark wood and marble, where the faces of previous governors glared down from oil paintings in heavy frames. My father's portrait hung directly behind my desk, a grim reminder that I was repeating his life exactly, down to the same grinding despair. My chief administrator, Proctor Mevren, arrived with the day's priority issues. Mevren was 63, rail-thin, with a face like weathered parchment and eyes that calculated resource allocation with the emotional investment of a servitor. He'd served my father and his father before that. He was, by all accounts, excellent at his job, which meant he was excellent at determining who lived and who died with maximum efficiency. "Governor," he said, bowing precisely 15 degrees as protocol demanded, "3 matters require immediate attention." I gestured for him to continue, already feeling the weight of decisions I hadn't yet made. First, the tithe shipment to Battlefleet Pacificus is delayed by 4 days due to warp current instabilities. The Admiral is displeased. He suggests the delay reflects poorly on your management. Translation: I would be blamed for the whims of the Anatorium itself. If the delay extended, I could face inquisitorial investigation. Governors had been executed for less. Second, Hab Block 212 has exceeded population capacity by 11%. The Departamento Munitorum recommends immediate reduction to optimal levels. Translation: kill 11% of the population of Hab Block 212 to maintain efficiency ratios. Approximately 40,000 people. Select them by whatever criteria seemed most administratively convenient. Lottery, age, productivity metrics. Render the bodies for protein paste. File the paperwork. Third, the birth lottery results for this year show a 7% increase in male births. The gender balance protocols require correction. Translation. Kill 7% of male infants to maintain the Departamento Munitorum's preferred gender ratios for long-term labor planning. Approximately 18,000 babies. They would die in the processing centers before their parents ever held them. The parents would be told their children were reassigned to Imperial service. Another lie we all pretended to believe. I stared at Mevrin. He stared back, with the empty patience of a man who'd delivered these kinds of reports for 40 years. "Your signature, Governor," he said, sliding 3 data slates across my desk. I picked up my stylus, real metal, weighted, with my family seal engraved on the handle. My father's stylus. His father's before that. I signed the first slate. 4 days of tithe delay would be explained, with sufficient grovel language to appease an admiral who commanded ships capable of reducing my entire world to ash. I signed the second slate. 40,000 people in Hab Block 212 would be gathered in the next week, told they were being relocated for agricultural reassignment, and efficiently executed in batches of 500. Their families would never know exactly what happened. The Imperium preferred it that way. My hand hovered over the third slate. 18,000 infants. I would kill 18,000 babies before they drew their first full breath. To satisfy demographic calculations made by men who'd never set foot on Sanctum Tertius, whose names I would never know, whose faces I would never see. The stylus shook in my hand. "Governor?" Mevrin's voice was carefully neutral. "In the Emperor's name," I whispered. Not because I believed, but because the words came automatically after decades of conditioning, a mantra beaten into me until it emerged reflexively, like breathing. I signed the third slate. Mevrin collected them efficiently, bowed his 15 degrees, and departed to begin implementing my murders. I sat alone in the office, surrounded by portraits of dead men who'd made the same decisions, signed the same death warrants, prayed the same empty prayers to a corpse god on a throne of gold while the Imperium ground millions into paste in his name. The Emperor protects, they told us. He'd never protected anyone I'd killed. The ecclesiarch ceremony that afternoon lasted 6 hours, exactly as predicted. The cathedral of his eternal radiance dominated Capital Primus's religious district, a massive structure of black stone and gold leaf. Its spire reaching 300 meters toward the sky, as if trying to pierce through to holy terror itself. Inside, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows broken only by hanging braziers of eternal flame. Stained glass windows depicted the Emperor in various propaganda-approved forms, crushing Xenos beneath his boot, extending benediction over kneeling masses, leading the Great Crusade with flaming sword held high. 10,000 faithful packed the cathedral. Workers granted the privilege of attending, minor nobles maintaining appearances, adeptus functionaries performing required religious observance. The air was thick with incense smoke, meant to induce mild euphoria and suggestibility. I'd been briefed on this years ago. The ecclesiarchy's incense contained compounds that caused minor hypoxia, making attendees more receptive to authority and religious messaging. Not worship, psychology disguised as devotion. I sat in the governor's box, an elevated platform that put me on display for the masses, wearing my ceremonial robes and the expression of pious attention I'd perfected over decades. My mind wandered despite my efforts to maintain focus. 18,000 babies. The ecclesiarch, a grotesquely fat man named Cardus Ven, who wore robes that cost more than most workers earned in their entire lives, droned through prayers from the Lectitio Divinitatis. His voice boomed through vox amplifiers with artificial reverb meant to sound divine. And lo, the Emperor shall protect the faithful and cast down the heretic, for his is the glory eternal, his is the power infinite. His is the throne of gold and bone, upon which humanity's future rests. Pretty words describing a corpse being kept barely alive by machinery, and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls were fed into the Astronomicon like fuel into a furnace. They told us it was holy. They told us it was necessary. Both could be true. But holiness and necessity didn't make it any less monstrous. "Let us pray," Ecclesiarch then commanded, and 10,000 people knelt in perfect synchronization to obey immediately. I knelt with them, bowing my head, forming the sign of the Aquila with my hands. Two-headed eagle, symbol of the Imperium, performed by crossing thumbs and spreading fingers like wings. My lips moved through prayers I'd memorized before I could read. "Emperor who sits in judgment, extend your protection over your faithful servants. Guard us from the heretic, the mutant, the Xenos. In your name we serve, in your name we die, in your name we are reborn in service eternal." The words were sounds, noise, conditioned responses. 40,000 people in Hab Block 212, 18,000 infants, 17 men dying of grain lung. The Emperor protects. Does he? And then something changed. The incense smoke thickened, curling through the cathedral's vast space with unusual density. The braziers flared brighter. The stained glass seemed to pulse with internal light. 10,000 voices chanted the litany of protection in perfect unison, the sound building into a droning vibration that I felt in my chest, my bones, my teeth. My vision blurred. No, not blurred. Expanded. I could suddenly see the cathedral not just as a physical space, but as something else. Something layered. Patterns of light and shadow that formed geometries my mind struggled to process. Numbers appearing in the air, not literally, but impressed into my consciousness with absolute clarity. Dates, times, calculations of impossible complexity, unfolding like flowers blooming in accelerated time. A voice spoke, not through my ears, but directly into my mind, bypassing the mundane channels of physical sound. "Alexander Ravius Ketch, you have been chosen," I gasped, my hands clutching the railing of the governor's box. Around me, the ceremony continued unchanged. No one else seemed to have heard. Chosen for what? I thought desperately, not sure if I was praying or hallucinating or having some kind of stroke. To purify. The signs are clear. The mathematics have always been present. You need only open your eyes to see what must be done. It was mine, my own thoughts, but amplified, clarified, given a certainty I'd never possessed. Or perhaps it was the incense chemicals finally achieving full hypoxic effect. Or a psychotic break after 11 years of accumulated stress and moral injury. Or something else. In that moment, I believed utterly that I had been touched by the divine. The geometry in my vision crystallized into comprehensible form. I saw patterns in the genetic markers of Sanctum Tertius's population. I saw which bloodlines carried hidden corruption, not literal chaos taint, but statistical deviations from genetic purity standards the Imperium had established millennia ago. I saw which birthdays aligned with astronomical events that indicated warp instability in the Immaterium at the moment of birth. I saw which physical traits correlated with psychological profiles that suggested latent heretical tendencies. I saw, with absolute crystalline clarity, that approximately half the population of Sanctum Tertius was tainted, and I understood, knew with religious certainty, that it was my sacred duty to purify them. The ecclesiarch's voice boomed, "And the emperor shall know his own, and the faithful shall be separated from the corrupt, and the purging flames shall cleanse what mercy cannot redeem." I stood abruptly, my legs moving without conscious command. 10,000 faces turned toward me. The ecclesiarch stopped mid-sentence, shocked by the breach of ceremony protocol. I raised my hand, the hand that had signed 18,000 death warrants that morning, and proclaimed in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own. "I have seen the truth. The Emperor has shown me the signs. We have been blind, but now we shall see. We have been impure, but now we shall be cleansed. In his name, the purification begins. The cathedral erupted in confused murmuring. The ecclesiarch's face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, then, and this was critical, calculation. He saw an opportunity. "The governor speaks with holy inspiration," Venn declared, his amplified voice overriding the crowd's confusion. "Witness the emperor's touch upon his chosen servant. What revelation has been granted?" "Governor Ketch?" I descended from the governor's box, moving through the parting crowd like a prophet in the primitive texts, seeing each face through my new vision, pure, glowing faintly gold in my perception, tainted, shadow-marked, corrupted by genetic or astrological deviation, uncurtain, requiring further examination. The mathematics were perfect, elegant, sacred. "Those with the mark of corruption must be removed," I announced. "Those born under signs of warp instability, those carrying genetic markers of impurity, those whose very existence offends the Emperor's vision of perfect humanity. I have seen the calculations. I have been shown the way." I pointed to a man in the crowd, random selection, guided by my new sight. He had red hair, bright copper red, unusual on Sanctum Tertius, where the population skewed dark-haired due to genetic drift. "Red hair," I said softly, the words coming from somewhere deep and certain. "The mark of genetic mutation, deviation from human standard, impurity." The man's face went white with terror. "My Lord Governor, I am faithful. I serve. Take him." I commanded the Arbeitsguards who stood at the cathedral's exits. They hesitated. Taking a citizen on a governor's say-so without proper charges was irregular, but not technically illegal. The governor had broad authority in matters of planetary security. "Take him," I repeated, and my voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, the certainty of a man who believed he was doing the Emperor's work. They took him. The cathedral was utterly silent now. 10,000 people frozen in shock and fear. Ecclesiarch Venn approached me, his face a mask of religious ecstasy that barely concealed calculating ambition. "Governor Ketch, you have been blessed with vision. The Emperor's will flows through you. Together, we shall purify Sanctum Tertius and make it a shining example for all the Imperium." He saw political opportunity. A governor claiming divine mandate gave the ecclesiarchy enormous power. He would ride my madness to greater influence, never believing I was truly chosen, only that I was a useful tool. I saw none of this. I saw only the sacred mathematics of purification. "We begin immediately," I announced. "Gather the records, all genetic files, all birth records, all astrological data. We will identify the tainted. We will separate them from the pure. We will cleanse this world in his name. The Emperor protects," they told me my entire life. Now, finally, I would help him protect. Now, finally, I would do something that mattered. Now, finally, I had purpose beyond signing death warrants and watching good men ground to paste. I was a saint, and saints purify. They brought me the records in the governor's palace war room, a vast chamber normally used for military strategic planning, now repurposed for what I understood to be holy work. The walls were lined with data screens, each one flickering with information I'd requisitioned from every administrative office on Sanctum Tertius. Genetic databases, birth registries, astrological charts calculated from the precise moment of each citizen's emergence from their mother's womb, medical records, biometric scans, criminal histories, work productivity scores, psychological evaluations, everything the Imperium tracked, and the Imperium tracked everything my staff worked in shifts around the clock, and I did not sleep. I found I didn't need to. The clarity I'd received in the cathedral sustained me with energy that felt boundless, divine. When I looked in the mirror now, my eyes seemed brighter, more focused. The exhaustion lines had smoothed. I looked younger, vital, possessed of purpose. Proctor Mevran stood beside me, his weathered face carefully neutral as I explained the purification protocols. "Red hair indicates genetic mutation," I said. marking categories on the data screen with my stylus. Deviation from the human baseline established in the pre-Unity genetic archives. The probability of chaos susceptibility increases by 17% in populations with red hair phenotype expression. They must be identified and removed. I spoke with absolute confidence, quoting statistics that appeared in my mind with crystalline precision. I did not question where these numbers came from. They felt true in the way that prayers felt true when I'd been a child. Before doubt crept in, before I understood that prayers were conditioning. But this wasn't conditioning. This was revelation. Mevrin cleared his throat delicately. Governor, that would affect approximately 200,000 citizens. The logistical implications are manageable, I interrupted smoothly. We begin with Capital Primus. Mandatory genetic screenings presented as routine medical evaluations. Those with the marker are detained for processing. The ecclesiarchy will provide the theological justification. The arbites will provide security. The Departamento Munitorum will handle the logistics they handle every day. They kill thousands for efficiency ratios, Mavrin. Surely they can kill thousands for purity. My chief administrator's face remained carefully blank, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern? Fear? Or was it the same calculating assessment he applied to all administrative problems? As you command, Governor, he said, and began drafting the orders. Ecclesiarch Venn arrived within the hour, his massive bulk carried by a grav platform because walking apparently offended his dignity. His face was flushed with excitement, his eyes glittering with the fervor of a man who saw opportunity wrapped in holy language. Governor Ketch, the Emperor's chosen instrument, I have drafted a proclamation for immediate vox cast to all citizens. It frames the purification as a sacred duty, a privilege to participate in his work. The faithful will embrace this with joy. He thrust a data slate at me. I scanned the text. Citizens of Sanctum Tertius. The Emperor has blessed our world with divine revelation through his chosen servant, Governor Alexander Ketch. In his infinite wisdom, he has shown us the signs of corruption that have infiltrated our population. Those marked by genetic impurity shall be granted the mercy of purging, that their taint not spread to the faithful. This is not punishment, this is salvation. Those selected for processing shall be cleansed, and their sacrifice shall purify our world in his name. Rejoice, for we are chosen to be made pure. The language was perfectly crafted, framing murder as mercy, genocide as salvation, my madness as divine mandate. The ecclesiarchy had millennia of practice turning atrocity into theology. Perfect, I said, and meant it. Begin the vox casts immediately, and ecclesiarch, prepare the cathedral incinerators. We'll need them operating at maximum capacity. Venn's smile was beatific. Already done, Governor. The Emperor protects through your wisdom. The first roundups began at dawn the next day. Arbite's squads moved through Capital Primus's residential blocks with biometric scanners, cross-referencing genetic data against the population registry. When they identified someone with red hair, natural red, not dye, the scanners could tell the difference. They were politely but firmly detained. Routine processing, the Arbites explained to confused families. The governor has mandated genetic purity screening. It's for the good of the Imperial. The Emperor protects. Most went quietly, conditioned by lifetimes of obedience to Imperial authority. Those who resisted were subdued with shock mauls, their bodies convulsing as neural disruptors overloaded their nervous systems. The Arbites were efficient. They'd been trained for this kind of work. The detained were transported to Processing Center Sigma, a facility that had previously been used for rendering agricultural waste into protein paste. The machinery required minimal modification. Bodies were bodies, whether they'd once been grain stalks or human beings. I watched the first batch through vid screens in the war room. 200 red-haired citizens lined up in groups of 50, standing in the clean white chamber where they'd been told to wait for purification rituals. The chamber had been a slaughterhouse for livestock before we repurposed it. It still had the drains built into the floor. The gas was colorless and odorless, a mercy, really. They didn't suffer long, approximately 4 minutes from gas release to complete cessation of movement. Then the chamber was ventilated, the bodies removed via automated conveyor systems, and the next batch was brought in. I felt nothing as I watched, not horror, not guilt. Only the calm satisfaction of seeing sacred mathematics made manifest. These deaths had meaning. These deaths were purification. These deaths would make Sanctum Tertius clean. By the end of week 1, we had processed 12,000 citizens of Capital Primus. The ash from the cathedral incinerators rose in thick black columns visible from kilometers away. The smell, that particular sweetness of rendered bone and fat, settled over the city like a blessing. The red-haired were only the beginning. Once I'd proven the system worked, once the logistical machinery was established and the population had been conditioned to accept the purges as holy work, the calculations revealed deeper layers of corruption. I spent 18 hours a day in the war room now, surrounded by data screens and astrological charts, tracing patterns that appeared with divine clarity. Proctor Mevren had stopped questioning my orders. Ecclesiarch Ven praised every new revelation as proof of the Emperor's guidance. The Arbites followed commands with mechanical precision. The second criterion emerged from astronomical data, birthdays. I saw it clearly one night. Or was it day? Time had become fluid, irrelevant, measured only in processing cycles, as I reviewed birth records cross-referenced against warp current fluctuations recorded by our orbital monitoring stations. Certain dates showed correlations. Births that occurred during warp instabilities in the Amatorium showed a 23% higher probability of producing individuals with heretical tendencies. The data was irrefutable. The mathematics were sacred. Anyone born on the 13th day of any month, I announced to my assembled staff. Anyone born during solar eclipses. Anyone born within 48 hours of recorded warp anomalies. These are marked by the Imperium at the moment of their creation. The taint is microscopic, invisible to crude instruments, but undeniable to those with eyes to see. I pointed to the data screens where I'd highlighted the correlations in glowing red. The numbers made sense to me with perfect clarity, though I noticed my staff exchanging glances of confusion. They couldn't see what I saw. They hadn't been chosen. Proctor Mevren spoke carefully. His voice, the measured tone of a man trying to reason with someone he feared was unreasonable. Governor, that would expand the purge to approximately 160 million citizens, nearly 40% of the planetary population. Yes, I said simply. 40%. The corruption runs deeper than we initially understood. But we are committed to this work, Mevren. We cannot stop halfway. A garden half-weeded still chokes. A body half-purged still dies of poison. The economic implications, he began, are irrelevant, I snapped, feeling anger for the first time in weeks. How dare he question the sacred work? The Emperor does not calculate economics, he calculates purity. We will maintain tithe production with the 60% who remain. The faithful can work twice as hard. They will be honored to do so, to make up for the absence of the tainted. Ecclesiarch Ven, who had grown even fatter on his increasing political power, nodded eagerly. The governor speaks truth. The faithful will rejoice at the opportunity to serve more completely. I shall draft new sermons, emphasizing the sacred nature of increased labor quotas. The expanded purges began within days. Now the Arbites moved through hab blocks with birth records, detaining anyone whose registration showed they'd emerged from the womb on a 13th day, or during an eclipse, or within the 48-hour windows I'd calculated around warp anomalies stretching back decades. The processing centers ran continuously. We'd activated 4 more facilities across Capital Primus, then expanded to the secondary cities. The cathedral incinerators couldn't keep pace, so we built new ones. Industrial-scale crematoriums that could process 1,000 bodies per hour, their chimneys belching ash that settled over Sanctum Tertius like gray snow. People stopped going outside without respirators. The ash got into everything, food, water, lungs. But this was the price of purity, and the faithful accepted it. Some resisted. In Hab Block 47, a group of workers barricaded themselves and refused to permit the Arbites to check birth records. They claimed the purges were against the Emperor's will, that I was possessed or insane, that this was heresy disguised as holiness. I authorized the Planetary Defense Force to resolve the situation with extreme prejudice. The PDF bombarded Hab Block 47 with artillery for 6 hours until the structure collapsed into rubble. Approximately 18,000 people died in the bombardment and subsequent fires. We didn't bother checking their birth records afterward. Resistance to purification was itself evidence of corruption. The rubble was bulldozed into a mass grave and covered with quick-setting rockcrete. A monument was erected. Here lie those who rejected purity. The Emperor's mercy is for the faithful alone. The resistance stopped after that. I no longer slept at all. Sleep was a weakness, a distraction from the holy work. When I looked in mirrors now, which I did rarely, having little interest in physical appearance, I saw a man transformed. My skin had taken on a waxy quality, stretched tight over bones that seemed more prominent. My eyes had developed a fevered brightness, pupils dilated permanently as if I existed in perpetual dim light. I'd lost approximately 18 kilos, my ceremonial robes hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten hunger. But I felt glorious, powerful, chosen. The voice that had spoken in the cathedral came more frequently now. Though I understood it was not external, it was my own enlightened consciousness, my mind operating at levels of clarity impossible for the unillumined. Sometimes I spoke aloud to it, and my staff had learned not to react when I carried on conversations with apparently empty air. The mathematics become more complex, I explained to the voice one night, alone in the war room surrounded by data screens covered in calculations only I could fully comprehend. Simple genetic and astrological markers were the first layer, but corruption runs deeper. There are behavioral patterns, psychological profiles, even the way someone walks or speaks that indicates internal taint. Yes, the voice agreed, which was to say, I agreed with myself with absolute conviction. The signs are everywhere once you learn to read them. The unclean announce themselves through 1,000 subtle markers. Left-handedness, I said, the revelation arriving fully formed, statistically correlated with deviant neural architecture. The ancients understood this. They called it sinister from the old Terran languages. Left, wrong, unnatural. The numbers calculated instantly. Approximately 11% of Sanctum Tertius's remaining population showed left-hand dominance in biometric records. 44 million people. By this point, we'd already processed 93 million. The population had been reduced to 400 million to 307 million. Soon, it would be 263 million. The pure were being separated from the corrupt, exactly as the sacred mathematics demanded. Proctor Mevrin had stopped coming to morning briefings. When I summoned him, he arrived looking decades older than his 63 years, his face gray with stress or horror, or perhaps both. The left-handed must be processed, I informed him, sliding the data slate across my desk. He stared at it for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Governor, I am left-handed. I looked at him, truly looked, and saw what I should have noticed before. 40 years of loyal service to 3 generations of governors. My father had trusted him absolutely. I had trusted him absolutely. And yet the mark was there, obvious now that I was paying attention. The sacred mathematics did not allow for exceptions based on sentiment or history. Then you understand this is mercy, I said gently, genuinely compassionate. You've served faithfully, Mevrin, but the corruption is cellular, neurological. It's not your fault, but it must be purged nonetheless. He closed his eyes. The Emperor protects, he whispered. Not a statement of faith, but a bitter epitaph. Through me, I agreed. He protects through the purification. Mevrin stood, made his final bow. Precisely 15 degrees even now, and walked quietly from my office. He reported to Processing Center Sigma within the hour. He did not resist. He understood his duty, even as I understood mine. I appointed a new chief administrator by evening. The work could not stop. The planetary population was now 197 million, down from 400 million at the start of the purification. 203 million people had been processed, cleansed, purged, their ash scattered across Sanctum Tertius like a blessing. The agri-world's production had dropped catastrophically. We'd missed 3 consecutive tithe shipments to Battlefleet Pacificus. The Admiral sent increasingly threatening communiques demanding explanation. I responded with theological treatises explaining the sacred mathematics of purification. I sent him copies of my calculations, the astrological charts, the genetic markers, the behavioral correlations. I explained that temporary disruption in grain production was acceptable when weighed against the eternal purity of Sanctum Tertius's population. He did not respond further. I assumed he understood. Ecclesiarch Venn had become my closest advisor, spending hours daily in the war room as I revealed new layers of corruption requiring purification. He'd grown even more grotesque with power and indulgence. His body swollen to the point where the grav platform struggled to carry his mass, his face perpetually flushed and sweating, his breath wheezing through lungs compressed by his own flesh. But he understood the sacred work. He crafted the sermons that kept the remaining faithful convinced of their righteousness. He administered the ecclesiarchy resources that kept the processing centers running smoothly. He was, in his way, indispensable. "Governor," he said one afternoon, his voice pitched with excitement, "I have received word from other subsector governors. They are impressed by the purity you've achieved. Several have inquired about implementing similar programs on their worlds. You are becoming an example, Ketch, a saint showing the way forward." Pride swelled in my chest, not the sinful pride the old theology warned against, but righteous satisfaction in work well done. "Then they must see the completion of the work," I declared. "Then organize a pilgrimage. Bring delegations from neighboring systems. Let them witness the purity we've achieved. Let them see what faith and mathematics can accomplish when combined with holy purpose." He bowed as low as his bulk permitted. "It shall be done, Saint Ketch." Saint. The title felt right. Natural. True. The pilgrimage occurred 3 months later. 17 delegations from nearby Imperial worlds, each consisting of planetary governors, ecclesiarchy officials, and administratum observers. They toured Capital Primus, walked through processing centers, reviewed my calculations, attended sermons in the Cathedral of His Eternal Radiance. I gave a speech to the assembled visitors, standing in the cathedral where my revelation had first occurred, surrounded by the faithful who had survived the purification. "You see before you a world transformed," I proclaimed, my voice carrying through vox amplifiers with holy resonance. "Where once corruption festered hidden, now purity reigns manifest. We have identified the tainted by sacred mathematics, revealed through the Emperor's grace. We have separated pure from impure. We have cleansed with holy fire. Sanctum Tertius is a testament to what can be achieved when faith transcends sentiment, when duty transcends mercy, when purity transcends politics." The remaining faithful, 197 million souls who had survived screening after screening, filled the cathedral and the streets beyond, their voices raised in chants, "Saint Ketch, Saint Ketch, the Emperor's chosen. Blessed be the purifier." I saw the visitors' faces. Some showed awe, some showed horror poorly concealed, some showed the calculating assessment of administrators wondering if my methods could solve their own purity problems. One visitor stood out, a severe woman in Arbite's command regalia, her face scarred from what looked like acid burns, her eyes cold and analytical as she studied me. She said nothing during the tour, asked no questions during the presentation, made no comment during the sermons. She simply watched and calculated. I should have recognized a threat, but I was beyond such mundane concerns. I was doing the Emperor's work. What threat could exist to one operating under divine mandate? The criteria for purification continued to expand as my understanding deepened. Eye color became relevant. Gray eyes showed correlation with warp sensitivity. Height variations beyond 2 standard deviations from the population mean suggested genetic instability. Certain speech patterns indicated neurological deviations from purity standards. The processing centers operated continuously now. The population dropped to 112 million, then 93 million, then 74 million. Sanctum Tertius's cities became ghost towns, whole hab blocks standing empty, their residents processed months or years prior. The agricultural fields continued operating with skeleton crews working 20-hour shifts to meet even fraction of our previous tithe commitments. Starvation began affecting the remaining faithful, but this was acceptable. Hunger purified the body as my work purified the world. I moved my operations from the governor's palace to the cathedral of his eternal radiance, establishing my headquarters in what had been Ecclesiarch Ven's personal chambers. The symbolism was appropriate. I was no longer merely a governor executing administrative functions. I was a saint performing sacred duty. Ven himself had grown so massive that he could barely move even with grav assist. His body was a monument to excess, flesh cascading over itself in rolls and folds, his face nearly invisible beneath swollen jowls. He ate continuously, massive feasts of corpse-starch paste flavored with chemical compounds, all while preaching sermons about the virtue of sacrifice and purity. The contradiction did not trouble me. Ven was pure by all mathematical criteria. His gluttony was a personal failing, not a genetic or astrological marker. The sacred calculations made these distinctions clear. I no longer looked human myself. When I caught my reflection in the polished black stone of the cathedral walls, I saw a skeletal figure draped in robes darkened with ash and old blood. Eyes burning with fevered intensity, in a face that was more skull than flesh. I looked like the saints in ancient Pict captures from primitive terra martyrs, consumed by holy purpose, flesh burned away by the intensity of their faith. Beautiful. The voice spoke to me constantly now, or rather, I spoke to myself in the voice, which was the same thing. Sometimes I lost track of which thoughts were mine and which were the voice's guidance. It didn't matter. We were unified in purpose. Nearly pure. The voice whispered through my own lips as I reviewed the latest processing reports. 61 million remain, but there are still hidden markers, still subtle corruptions. The work continues until perfection is achieved. How will I know when it's complete? I asked aloud, alone in the chamber surrounded by data screens and astrological charts covering every surface. You will know because the mathematics will reach zero. All corruption identified, all impurity purged, only the absolutely pure remaining. And myself, am I pure? Then you are the instrument. Purity flows through you. You are beyond such calculations. Yes, that made sense. I was the tool through which the Emperor worked. The saint who purified, I existed outside the normal categories. 339 million people had been processed. The remaining 61 million existed in a state I can only describe as collective trauma. They worked the fields in silence. They attended mandatory sermons without resistance. They reported suspected impurities in their neighbors with the mechanical obedience of servitors. Fear had ground them into perfect compliance. This was purity. This was order. This was the Emperor's vision made manifest. I ordered the construction of a new throne room in the cathedral's deepest level, a chamber that would serve as both administrative center and monument to the holy work. The design came to me in what I understood to be divine inspiration. The throne itself would be constructed from the skulls of the purified, not an insult to them, a memorial, a testament. My workers, faithful who had proven their purity through years of survival, gathered skulls from the mass graves and crematorium ash pits. They cleaned each one carefully, treating them with chemical preservatives, then assembled them according to my specifications, 17 million skulls forming a throne, and surrounding pillars mortared together with compounds made from rendered bone paste. The chamber took 8 months to complete. When I first descended into it, I wept with joy. Actual tears. The first moisture my body had produced in years, besides sweat and occasional blood when I bit my lips during particularly intense calculation sessions. The walls were skulls. The floor was paved with skulls embedded in clear resin, so I walked upon the faces of the purified. The throne rose 3 meters high, a cathedral of bone, every surface a face frozen in death. I climbed the throne and sat, and the rightness of it resonated through my entire being. This was where saints belonged, surrounded by the evidence of their holy work, elevated above the mundane, connected to those they'd shepherded into purity. Beautiful, Ecclesiarch Venn wheezed, his massive bulk carried by 3 grav platforms now because 1 was insufficient. His face was purple with strain, sweat pouring down in rivers. You have created a sacred space, Saint Ketch. The Emperor surely smiles upon this monument to faith. I barely heard him. I was communing with the voice, with my own enlightened consciousness, calculating the final purges. 58 million remain, I whispered. But the calculations show more corruption, always more, layers within layers. New criteria revealed themselves. Certain family names showed statistical correlations with historical heresy. Specific dental patterns suggested genetic drift from human standard. The angle of cheekbones, the length of fingers, the pattern of hair growth. Everything was data. Everything was calculable. Everything was subject to purification. We continue, I declared from my throne of skulls, until the mathematics reach perfection. Until only the absolutely pure remain, however many that may be. Venn nodded, then gasped, clutching at his chest. His face went from purple to white. He made a gurgling sound, his eyes wide with panic. Heart failure. His grotesque body finally overwhelmed by its own mass. He collapsed from the grav platforms, hitting the skull floor with a wet, heavy impact. Blood leaked from his mouth, pooling among the faces of the dead. I watched with detached curiosity as he convulsed, his fingers scrabbling uselessly at the resin-covered skulls, seeking purchase that would never come. "The Emperor protects," I said softly, quoting the propaganda we'd been fed our entire lives. He died within minutes, his final expression one of shock rather than the holy rapture he'd spent 3 years preaching about. I ordered his body rendered with the others. His skull would be added to the throne room. In death, all were equal before the mathematics of purity. The first I knew of the Imperial intervention was when the Vox system crackled to life with an external transmission powerful enough to override all planetary communications. Governor Alexander Ravius Ketch, this is Lord Commander 7 of the Adeptus Arbites, speaking with authority granted by the Segmentum Pacificus High Command. You are hereby ordered to cease all planetary operations and submit yourself for examination regarding gross violations of Imperial law and suspected heresy. Surrounded by the 43 faithful who remained as my personal attendants, all that was left of my staff, the rest having been purged for various markers of corruption revealed over the years. Heresy? They called my holy work heresy. I am doing the Emperor's work, I responded calmly into the Vox pickup. I am purifying Sanctum Tertius according to sacred mathematics revealed through divine inspiration. I am removing corruption that has festered for millennia. I am a saint performing his holy duty. Static, then Lord Commander 7's voice, hard and cold. Governor Ketch, you have killed 346 million Imperial citizens without proper authorization from the High Lords of Terra. You have destroyed a productive agri-world, creating sector-wide food shortages that have resulted in starvation deaths on 17 neighboring systems. You have missed 43 consecutive tithe shipments. Your actions, regardless of claimed theological justification, constitute catastrophic dereliction of duty and possible chaos corruption. I laughed, a sound like breaking glass, harsh and wrong even to my own ears. Chaos? I have been purging chaos susceptibility. I have been removing those touched by the warp. I have been creating the purest human population the Imperium has ever seen. 54 million souls, every one of them screened and verified pure by genetic, astrological, and behavioral criteria. This world will stand as a monument to what faith and mathematics can achieve. Governor Ketch, you will submit to arrest immediately, or we will take you by force. You have 6 hours to comply. The transmission ended. I looked to my faithful 43. They stared back with wide, frightened eyes, but also with conviction. They had survived 3 years of purification. They were the purest of the pure. They believed in the work as much as I did. They do not understand, I told them. They are blind to the sacred mathematics. They call purity heresy because they cannot see what we see. They will try to stop the work before it is complete. One of my attendants, a thin young man named Corvus, who served as my chief data analyst, spoke hesitantly. "Saint Ketch, what do we do?" I smiled, feeling the stretched skin of my face crack slightly with the unfamiliar expression. We finish the work. We calculate the final criteria, and if the Arbites break through before completion, they will find us here, surrounded by the evidence of our righteousness. They can kill this body, but they cannot kill the truth of what we've accomplished. I stood from my throne, skeletal frame draped in robes so stiff with dried blood and ash, they could stand without a body inside them. Seal the cathedral, activate all defense systems, and bring me the final population records. We have 54 million left to screen. I estimate 30% show subtle markers we haven't yet fully addressed. That means we need to process approximately 16 million more. The mathematics were so close to completion, so close to perfection. I would not stop, not when the end was finally visible. The Arbites surrounded the Cathedral of His Eternal Radiance with an overwhelming force. 3,000 officers in full combat gear, supported by PDF units who had surrendered immediately when Imperial authority arrived, and backed by orbital weapons capable of reducing the cathedral to a crater. But they didn't use the orbital bombardment. They wanted me alive, apparently. Wanted to examine me, understand what had happened, determine if this was madness or chaos corruption, or some other phenomenon worth studying before execution. I spent the 6 days of the siege in my throne room, continuing the calculations even as explosions shook the cathedral's foundations. The 43 faithful worked the data schemes, processing the final population records, identifying the last markers of corruption. 32 million would remain when the work was complete. 32 million absolutely pure human beings, verified by every possible criteria, the purest population in Imperial space. On the 2nd day of the siege, the Arbites breached the outer cathedral walls. I heard the gunfire echoing through the vast structure as my faithful defenders, ordinary citizens armed with lasguns and blind conviction, attempted to slow the advance. They lasted 4 hours before being overwhelmed. The Arbites were professional killers. My faithful were farmers who believed in mathematics. On the 4th day, the Arbites reached the cathedral's main sanctuary. I watched through vid feeds as they entered the vast space where I'd received my first revelation 3 years prior. The room was different now. The pews had been removed and replaced with processing equipment, the floor stained with years of accumulated blood that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. The stained glass windows depicting the Emperor had been modified with my own additions. Complex geometric patterns overlaying the original images, sacred mathematics made visual. The Arbites' commander, a stern man whose face was half covered by a rebreather against the cathedral's stench, stopped in the center of the sanctuary and spoke into his vox. "Emperor's mercy. This entire place is a charnel house. Ketch has gone completely insane." Insane? I was the sanest person on Sanctum Tertius. I was the only one who saw clearly. On the 6th day, they reached the entrance to my throne room. One final door. 3 meters of blessed adamantium, sealed and barred, covered in prayers and calculations I'd carved into the metal with my own hands over months of sleepless work. I heard them outside, setting shaped charges. The 43 faithful knelt around my throne, heads bowed in prayer. They chanted the calculations like mantras. 0.73 probability of corruption, 2.1 standard deviations from genetic mean, 17% increased warp susceptibility. The mathematics reveal truth. The mathematics purify. The Emperor protects through numbers. I sat on my throne of 17 million skulls. I'd counted each one personally, you understand, because a saint must know his flock. And felt profound peace. The work was complete. 54 million pure souls remained on Sanctum Tertius. I'd identified the 16 million who required final processing, but circumstances had prevented implementation. Still, the knowledge existed. The calculations were recorded. Future saints could complete what I'd begun. The explosions were very loud. Which brings us to now. The adamantium door is a twisted ruin, smoke pouring through the gap. I hear boots on bone, the Arbites walking across my floor of skulls, climbing toward my throne. Lord Commander 7 appears first, flanked by 20 officers in full armor, weapons trained on me and my faithful. His face is utterly expressionless as he takes in the throne room. Walls of skulls, floor of skulls, throne of skulls, and the skeletal madman sitting atop it all wearing robes that are more bloodstained than fabric. Governor Alexander Ravius Ketch, he says formally, his voice flat and dead. By the authority of the Adeptus Arbites and the High Lords of Terra, you are under arrest for crimes against the Imperium, mass murder of Imperial citizens, dereliction of duty, and suspected chaos corruption. You will submit immediately or be executed where you sit. I look at him with eyes that haven't blinked in days, in weeks, that see layers of reality he cannot comprehend. I am a saint, I say calmly. I have purified Sanctum Tertius according to sacred mathematics revealed by the Emperor himself. I have separated pure from impure. I have done his work. You have murdered 346 million Imperial citizens based on insane criteria like hair color and birthdays. You have destroyed a productive agri-world and caused sector-wide famine. You have accomplished nothing but pointless genocide, driven by untreated psychosis. They were tainted, I explained patiently. The mathematics proved it. Genetic markers, astrological correlations, behavioral patterns, all indicating corruption. I removed the corrupted. Only the pure remain. This is the Emperor's will. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne, 7 says bluntly, shocking my 43 faithful who gasp at the heresy. He doesn't have will. He doesn't speak to governors. He doesn't reveal sacred mathematics. You suffered a psychotic break and murdered hundreds of millions because no one stopped you soon enough. His words slide off me like water off blessed ceramite. He is blind, unillumined, unable to see the truth of the work. You will execute me, I say, not as a question but as a statement of fact. And you will call me, but the mathematics remain. The calculations are recorded. Future generations will see I was right. I was the saint who showed the way. 7 sighs, a sound of profound exhaustion that I recognize from my own voice 3 years ago, before enlightenment. We're granting you the mercy of a quick death catch, more mercy than you showed anyone else. He raises his bolt pistol, a massive weapon designed to kill space marines, grotesque overkill for one skeletal governor on a throne of bones. I think, in the final moment of my father. I remember him in his office at 3 a.m, staring at reports, his face old and tired. I watch good men ground to paste, he'd said, and I call it necessary. I'd called it purity. I'd called it holy. I'd called it the Emperor's work. The propaganda had promised. The Emperor protects. He hadn't protected the 346 million I'd killed. He hadn't protected me from my own madness. He hadn't protected anyone. But in that final moment, as 7's finger tightened on the trigger, I understood with perfect clarity what the voice had been all along. Not divine revelation, Not the emperor's guidance, not sacred mathematics revealed through holy inspiration. Just my own mind, broken by stress and indoctrination, and the impossible weight of governing in an empire that worshipped a corpse and called atrocity duty. My brain, manufacturing meaning in patterns where none existed, finding false order in chaos, creating a purpose that would justify the murders I signed every day, transforming administrative genocide into sacred mission. I'd killed 346 million people because I couldn't bear to be my father, signing death warrants with dead eyes while pretending it meant nothing. So I'd convinced myself it meant everything. The bolt round entered my skull at 3,000 meters per second, and my consciousness exploded into nothing. Then awareness. But awareness without context, without body, without time. I am, was, will always be. Governor Alexander Ravius Ketch. This is not life. This is not death. This is the space between, the moment stretched eternal, the final second of consciousness, caught in amber. They told us the emperor protects. They told us the faithful would be rewarded. They told us death was merely passage to service eternal at his side. All lies, all propaganda, all control mechanisms to make us obedient. There is no golden throne in eternity, no emperor's blessing, no reward for faith. Only this, the moment of realization, the understanding of what I'd done, looping forever in the darkness. 346 million faces appear in the void, not literally, but impressed into my eternal consciousness. I see them all, everyone. The red-haired child who'd clutched his father's hand as the Arbites took him to processing. The left-handed woman who'd begged to see her son one last time. The man born on the 13th who'd served the Imperium faithfully for 60 years before I decided his birthday indicated corruption. I see them. I know their names. I understand with the clarity that only comes when all delusion is burned away. That I was never a saint. I was a broken man who convinced himself his madness was holiness, who transformed psychosis into theology, who killed millions to feel like those deaths had meaning beyond the meaningless deaths I'd been signing for years. The emperor never spoke to me. My own fractured mind spoke to me, and I was so desperate for purpose that I believed it was divine. The world I left behind, 54 million survivors, traumatized beyond healing, a population that had been 400 million reduced by 87%. An entire civilization's worth of genetic diversity erased, families destroyed, cities emptied. Agricultural production collapsed to 20% of pre-purge levels. The Imperium's response was efficient and utterly predictable. A new planetary governor was appointed, a stern administrator named Valdus Kren, whose first acts were to dismantle all my purification protocols, restore normal imperial governance, and implement mandatory psychological screening for the traumatized population. The cathedral was demolished, its 17 million skulls gathered and given mass burial in a crater that was then sealed with rockcrete and declared forbidden ground. My throne room was buried under 300 meters of rubble and quickcrete, entombing the evidence of my holy work. My name was officially stricken from all records. The portraits of previous governors in the palace were updated. My father's remained, but where my portrait should have hung was simply blank wall. I became unpersoned, erased, as if I'd never existed. Ecclesiarch Ven's body was discovered during the cathedral clearing operations. His corpse had been partially rendered in one of the processing centers before the siege ended operations. His skull was identified and given separate burial with full ecclesiarchy honors, because apparently his complicity in the genocide was forgiven due to his holy office. The 43 faithful who'd stayed with me to the end were executed by the Arbites. Quick deaths. Mercy, they called it. Though I wonder if mercy would have been letting them live with what they'd believed, what they'd helped accomplish. The Imperium's official report classified the entire incident as temporary governmental dysfunction due to untreated stress-induced psychosis, exacerbated by ecclesiarchy enablement, not heresy, not chaos corruption. Just madness, enabled by a system that gave absolute power to governors and provided no oversight until catastrophic failure occurred. 17 neighboring systems experienced severe famine due to Sanctum Tertius's failed tithe shipments. Estimated deaths from starvation, 43 million. Total deaths, directly and indirectly caused by my 3-year reign as saint, 389 million. The Imperium absorbed these losses the way it absorbed all losses, by updating population records, adjusting tithe quotas, and continuing forward as if nothing had happened. In a galaxy where billions died daily in the Emperor's name, what was 300 million more? Governor Voldus Kren sits in the same office where I sat, at the same desk, looking at similar reports. Population reduction required in Hab Block 7 due to overcrowding. Recommended method: lottery selection, processing through protein reclamation facilities. Estimated affected: 12,000 citizens. He stares at the data slate for a long moment. His hand hovers over the stylus. His face shows the same exhaustion my father's face showed, the same exhaustion my face showed before enlightenment or madness, or whatever word we use for what I became. The Emperor protects, he whispers, not because he believes, but because the conditioning runs so deep that the words emerge automatically. He signs the order. 12,000 people will die because efficiency ratios demand it. Their bodies will be processed. Their protein will feed other workers. The cycle continues. The only difference between Governor Kren and St. Ketch is that Kren calls it administrative necessity, while I called it holy purification. The deaths are the same. The grinding brutality of the Imperium is the same. I just made the mistake of believing it meant something. In my darkness, this eternal moment of consciousness between the bolt round entering my skull and final cessation, I am left with questions that have no answers. Was I insane? Yes. Clearly, objectively. The psychosis is evident in retrospect. But was I wrong? The Imperium kills millions daily for administrative convenience, resource management, efficiency ratios, political necessity. Governors sign death warrants as routine paperwork. The Imperium renders its own citizens into components and calls it. I did the same thing, but I called it holy. I gave the deaths meaning through theology, instead of hiding behind bureaucratic language. Does that make me worse than every other governor who signs execution orders with dead eyes and calls it duty? Or does it make me the same, just more honest about the horror? The Emperor protects. That's what they told us. That's what the propaganda claimed. That's what the priests chanted and the indoctrination sessions reinforced, and the ceremonial oils anointed us to believe. But the Emperor is a corpse maintained by machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls burn to keep the Astronomicon lit. The Emperor doesn't protect, the Emperor consumes. And we, governors and citizens and soldiers and priests, we all serve the consumption. We all feed the machine with our lives and our deaths, and our desperate need to believe the suffering has purpose. I believed it had purpose. I believed the deaths meant something. I believed I was chosen, special, a saint performing holy work. The cruelty is that I was wrong. But the greater cruelty is that everyone else who kills in the Emperor's name is equally wrong, and they don't even have madness as an excuse. They're simply following orders. Somewhere on Sanctum Tertius, in the ruins of Capital Primus where ash still settles in the cracks between buildings, a young administrator named Marcus Severin reviews his first weekly reports. He is 26 years old, newly appointed to the Departamento Munitorum, eager to serve, faithful in the way that young men are faithful before the system grinds them into components. The report shows efficiency losses in agricultural sector 12. 300 workers are underperforming due to grief. They lost family members in what they're starting to call the purge years, though officially that period doesn't exist in Imperial records. The report recommends psychological reconditioning, or, failing that, replacement through the labor lottery system. Marcus signs the order without hesitation. It's his job, It's necessary. The system requires it. The Emperor protects, he murmurs as he signs, believing it fully. I watch him from my eternal darkness, and I understand that he is me. That I was him. That every administrator and governor and functionary who signs death warrants while believing they serve a greater purpose is caught in the same cycle. The only difference is I broke. I couldn't maintain the fiction that killing for efficiency was somehow more righteous than killing for purity. I couldn't sign 18,000 execution orders with empty eyes and call it duty. So I convinced myself it was holy instead. And 346 million people died because I needed the deaths to mean something more than they did. My name will always be Governor Alexander Ravius Ketch. They called me Saint Ketch for 3 years while I murdered my way toward a purity that never existed. They call me a footnote in classified reports now, a cautionary example of what happens when governors break under stress without psychological support systems. They erased my portrait. They buried my throne. They scattered my victims' ashes across the agri-fields as fertilizer, turning 346 million people into nutrients for grain that will feed soldiers who will die in wars they don't understand, for an emperor who doesn't care. The cycle continues without me. Marcus Severin will sign execution orders and call it duty. Governor Valdus Kren will authorize population reductions and call it necessity. The ecclesiarchy will preach about the emperor's protection while citizens die by millions. The Imperium will consume its own children and call it governance. And somewhere, eventually, another governor will break. Another mind will fracture under the weight of signing deaths that never end. Another man will convince himself the horror has meaning beyond the horror itself. Maybe he'll call it purity like I did. Maybe he'll find some other word to transform murder into meaning. But the deaths will be the same. Because the Imperium is a machine that runs on human suffering, and we are all, saints and sinners, faithful and heretics, sane and mad. We are all just fuel for the fire. The Emperor protects, they told us. The Emperor protects nothing. He's just another tyrant on a throne of skulls. And I, Saint Ketch, Governor Ketch, Alexander Ravius Ketch, murderer of 346 million souls, I am just another skull in that throne now. Indistinguishable from all the others, forgotten already, another component ground to paste in the machinery of the Imperium's eternal, meaningless grinding horror. This is Warhammer 40,000, where faith is programming, where gods are parasites or corpses, or both, where suffering has no purpose except to perpetuate more suffering, where the only protection is the protection we lie about, to survive another day. My name was Alexandra Vies Ketch. I thought I was special. I was wrong.